I'm Caitlin Collins, and this is one of those moments when power stops pretending to be subtle. A president is pulled from his country in the dark of night, shackled, flown to New York. And in a courtroom, he looks straight ahead and says, "I am still the president." 2 hours later, back in Caracas, another oath is taken. Delcy Rodriguez raises her hand, not in celebration, but in pain. She calls it a kidnapping. The United States calls it justice. And suddenly, the question is no longer who governs Venezuela, but who gets to decide what legitimacy even means anymore. You're not just watching a legal case, you're watching sovereignty collide with force, law collide with aircraft. Oil, power, and global precedent collide in real time. If you want to understand how moments like this reshape countries and the world, stay with me. Because before we talk about consequences, we need to understand what problem everyone claims they're solving. What exactly is the problem here? The United States says this was never about regime change. It calls the operation law enforcement. A surgical move to arrest a man. It labels a narco-terrorist, a fugitive, an illegitimate leader hiding behind power. Venezuela tells a completely different story. To them, this wasn't justice. It was an armed attack, an invasion without permission, a violation of sovereignty carried out with aircraft, soldiers, and handcuffs. And in between those two narratives sits the rest of the world. The United Nations convenes an emergency session. Ambassadors trade words like weapons. One side says legitimacy was lost long ago. The other says legitimacy cannot be seized by force. This is why Delcy Rodriguez's swearing in matters. It wasn't just procedural, it was symbolic continuity power staying inside the system while the figurehead was removed. Maduro insists he is still president. The US insists he never was. And Venezuela insists no foreign court gets to decide that question. So this isn't only about one man in shackles. It's about who defines leadership, law, and order when institutions disagree. And to understand why this collision was inevitable, we have to go backward into the history that made this moment possible. This moment didn't appear out of nowhere. It sits at the end of a long chain of unresolved legitimacy. For years, Nicolas Maduro governed under constant dispute. The United States never recognized him as a legitimate president. It treated him instead as a criminal figure, accused, indicted, wanted. Venezuela, meanwhile, treated him as the head of state, backed by institutions, allies, and public displays of loyalty. That split reality hardened over time. Two systems operating in parallel, one legal, one political. One claiming jurisdiction through courts, the other claiming authority through sovereignty. As pressure built, the focus narrowed. Not on reform, not on mediation, but on removal. That's where the accusations matter. Drug trafficking, terrorism, weapons. They weren't just charges, they were mechanisms. A legal framework that allowed force to be reframed as arrest. At the same time, Venezuela's leadership prepared for continuity. Vice presidents exist for moments like this. So when Maduro was taken, power did not collapse. It transferred, and that's the critical point. This wasn't chaos. It was a controlled rupture. The line was crossed in the early hours of Saturday. More than 150 aircraft, over $2 US personnel. A coordinated overnight operation that moved fast, decisively, and without consent. This was not a warning shot. This was execution. By the time the world woke up, Nicolas Maduro was gone, taken from Venezuelan soil by foreign forces. His wife beside him. No negotiation, no handover ceremony, just extraction. Within hours, the framing battle began. Washington called it a surgical law enforcement operation. Clean, precise, necessary. Caracas called it something else entirely. An illegitimate armed attack, a kidnapping, an act of military aggression dressed up as justice. And then came the image that hardened positions. Maduro in a New York courtroom, shackled, defiant, declaring himself president while a judge told him there would be a time and a place for those arguments. That single scene did more than any statement. It transformed a legal case into a global crisis. Because once a sitting leader appears in chains, precedent is set. If this can happen here, it can happen elsewhere. That fear rippled outward, and beneath it sat something even more powerful, and far less spoken about, what sat beneath all the language of justice was a system quietly revealing itself. This was never only about Nicolas Maduro as a person. It was about access, leverage, and control over what comes next. The United States made its position unmistakable. A country holding the largest energy reserves in the world, Washington argued, could not remain in the hands of what it called an illegitimate leader, especially one now labeled a fugitive from justice. Law became the entry point, but economics became the gravity. Within hours of the operation, the message was clear. The US would run Venezuela until a safe and proper transition was achieved. Oil companies would move in, infrastructure would be fixed, money would start flowing again. This is how modern power operates, not through occupation alone, but through conditional legitimacy. You are recognized if you comply, you are removed if you don't, and yet the mechanism didn't function as cleanly as planned. Because removing a leader does not automatically remove a system. Institutions remained intact. The National Assembly convened, an interim president was sworn in, crowds gathered in support, not collapse, which exposed the flaw in the design. Force can extract a man, but it cannot instantly extract authority. And that contradiction set the stage for the second rupture, one that would push this crisis beyond Venezuela's borders. The second rupture didn't come from Caracas. It came from the world reacting. Within hours, the crisis moved to New York. Not the courtroom, the United Nations. An emergency Security Council session, raised voices, hard language, no consensus. Venezuela's ambassador called it an illegitimate armed attack, a violation with no legal justification. The words were chosen carefully, because once an action is labeled aggression, everything that follows escalates. The US response was equally direct. Maduro was not a president, they said. He was a so-called leader, a fugitive from justice. And the operation was not war, it was law enforcement. That distinction mattered, because if this was law enforcement, it set a precedent far beyond Venezuela. It suggested borders no longer protect leaders once legitimacy is disputed. Then came the pressure. Public warnings, direct threats toward Delcy Rodriguez. A message delivered through interviews, not diplomacy, cooperate or pay a bigger price. At the same time, Rodriguez signaled restraint, an openness to cooperation, carefully framed within international law. So the crisis entered its most unstable phase. Not open war, not peace, but a global standoff where words, recognition, and timing became weapons. And in moments like this, the people always feel it first. If you're Venezuelan, this doesn't feel like diplomacy. It feels like shock. You wake up to images of your president in shackles. You hear foreign leaders arguing over your country as if it's a case file. You're told this is about law or order or the future, but none of that answers the question in your kitchen or on your street. Will there be peace? Will there be work? Will this make life calmer or harder? Thousands gathered outside the National Assembly, not because everything is fine, but because uncertainty is worse than clarity. Because when power is contested, it's ordinary people who carry the weight. Prices, jobs, stability, fear. Delcy Rodriguez didn't speak of victory. She spoke of pain. Of spiritual and economic tranquility, words chosen for a population that has lived too long without either. And if you're watching from outside Venezuela, this is where distance disappears. Because today, it's their sovereignty being tested. Tomorrow, it could be someone else's. If you want to understand how global power decisions reach individual lives, stay with me. Because this crisis doesn't stop at Venezuela's borders. What happened in Venezuela didn't stay in Venezuela. The moment Maduro appeared in a US courtroom, every capital noticed. Because this wasn't just about one country. It was about precedent. If a sitting leader can be seized, flown across borders, and tried in a foreign court, then the rules shift. Allies reassess protection. Adversaries reassess risk. Neutral states reassess silence. At the United Nations, the debate exposed a fracture, not between democracy and dictatorship, but between force and process. Between those who believe legitimacy can be enforced and those who believe it must be contained within borders. Energy markets felt it immediately. Venezuela's reserves are not theoretical. They are strategic. Control over them ripples through supply chains, prices, and influence far beyond Latin America. And then there's the message to smaller states. Power no longer waits for collapse. It intervenes early, decisively, and publicly then dares the world to respond. Some governments saw deterrence. Others saw danger, because once legality becomes selective, stability becomes fragile. This is how regional crises become global anxiety. Not through explosions, but through uncertainty. And now, with no resolution in sight, the future fractures into possibilities. The future now splits into 3 paths, and none of them are clean. The first is the best-case scenario. Rodriguez stabilizes the government. Limited cooperation with the United States begins. Tensions cool without full submission. Maduro's case stays in court, not in the streets. Venezuela regains partial economic breathing room while holding on to institutional control. It's not resolution, it's containment. The second path is more fragile. A prolonged standoff. Rodriguez governs under constant pressure. Sanctions shift, but don't disappear. Threats replace dialogue. Venezuela survives, but frozen politically, economically, diplomatically. Power exists, but legitimacy remains contested everywhere that matters. And then there's the third scenario, the dangerous one, escalation. If cooperation fails, pressure hardens. Economic leverage turns into political isolation. Internal fractures widen. What began as a law enforcement operation morphs into sustained external control without formal occupation, but with permanent influence. Here's the deeper truth. This isn't just Venezuela's future being tested. It's the global system's tolerance for force disguised as law. If legitimacy can be removed by aircraft and courts combined, then sovereignty becomes conditional. And conditional sovereignty is not stability. It's volatility, waiting for its next case. Which brings us to the final question, what this moment actually teaches us. This story isn't really about Nicolas Maduro. It's about a world where power no longer waits for permission, where legitimacy is argued in courtrooms, enforced by aircraft, and defended in parliaments all at once. Maduro stood in a New York courtroom and said he was still president. Delcy Rodriguez stood in Caracas and took an oath with pain, not triumph. And somewhere between those 2 rooms, a line was crossed that won't be uncrossed. Because once a leader is removed this way, the system remembers. Other governments watch, other presidents calculate, and ordinary people absorb the risk. The United States says this was justice. Venezuela says it was aggression. The truth is more unsettling. It was a test of how far power can go before the world pushes back. A test of whether sovereignty still means borders or behavior. And here's the question you're left with. If legitimacy can be taken, who decides when yours is next? If you want to keep understanding how global power is being reshaped, quietly, decisively, and in real time, follow this channel. Because this isn't the end of the story.